Commander Zekthor stepped off the shuttle and looked around at the human military academy. His 4 eyes took in every detail of the large campus spread across the Colorado mountains. He was a Vraxian soldier, and his people were known across the galaxy as some of the best warriors. They had conquered 17 different star systems through superior fighting skills and advanced technology. This visit to Earth was supposed to be simple, just a diplomatic gesture to welcome humans into the Galactic Council. A human with gray hair walked up to meet him. The man wore a uniform with many badges and introduced himself as Colonel Henry Burton, the leader of this academy. He held out his hand for a handshake. Zekthor took it and was surprised at how strong the grip was. Humans looked weak compared to most species in the galaxy. They were small, standing only about 6 feet tall. They had no natural armor, no claws, no fangs. Their bodies seemed fragile. Yet somehow, they had survived on their dangerous planet and built ships that could travel faster than light in less than 100 years. Burton smiled at him and said, "Welcome to our academy, Commander. We are glad to have you here for the week. I think you will find our training very interesting." Zekthor's translation device changed the words into his language, but he noticed something strange in Burton's voice. Was the human amused about something? Humans were known for their odd sense of humor throughout the galaxy. Zekthor decided not to worry about it. The first day was spent in classrooms. Zekthor sat in the back and watched young human cadets learn about war tactics and strategy. These students were barely adults by human standards, most of them around 20 years old. What bothered Zekthor was not what they learned, but how they learned it. The teachers did not just show them great victories from history. They spent most of the time studying defeats, human losses, terrible mistakes that cost thousands of lives. And the students looked at these failures with cold eyes, picking them apart like scientists studying dead animals. One teacher, a captain named Ryan Phillips, stood in front of a class and talked about something called the Charge of the Light Brigade. He explained how 600 cavalry soldiers rode straight into enemy fire because of confused orders. Almost all of them died. A young female student named Amy raised her hand and said, "That shows us that being brave without being smart is just throwing your life away, sir. We should always check our orders, especially when they sound crazy." Zekthor felt a chill run through his body. In the Vraxian military, soldiers never questioned orders. They honored their dead and moved forward. That was how they stayed strong. But these humans were different. They cut open their ancestors' mistakes and studied them like medical students studying a body. They learned from death instead of just honoring it. During lunch, Zekthor ate with some of the cadets. They asked him questions about his home world and his military service. A young man named Paul asked him how Vraxian soldiers trained. Zekthor explained their system. Young Vraxians trained for 5 years in combat schools. They learned to fight in formation, to follow orders without question, and to use their advanced weapons with precision. They were taught that honor in battle was everything. The cadets listened politely, but Zekthor saw something in their eyes that worried him. They were not impressed. They were evaluating him, judging his words, looking for weaknesses in the Vraxian system. A cadet named Jennifer asked, "What happens if your commanders make a bad decision? Do you just follow it anyway?" "No." Zekthor explained that commanders were chosen for their wisdom and experience. Bad decisions were rare because only the best rose to leadership positions. Another student named Carl said, "But mistakes happen." Zekthor did not have a good answer. In Vraxian culture, you did not plan for your leaders to fail. You trusted them completely. The afternoon brought more classroom observation. Zekthor watched a lesson on something humans called asymmetric warfare. The teacher, Lieutenant Sandra Pierce, explained how a smaller, weaker force could defeat a larger, stronger enemy. She showed examples from human history. Small groups using surprise attacks, farmers defeating professional armies, rebels winning against empires. Every example showed humans finding ways to win when they should have lost. One case study particularly disturbed Zekthor. It was about a human conflict where one side pretended to surrender, then attacked when the enemy came to accept the surrender. In Vraxian culture, this would be the worst dishonor imaginable. A warrior who faked surrender would be executed by their own people. But Lieutenant Pierce taught it as a valid tactic. She explained when it might work and when it would fail. The students took notes. They asked questions about how to make the fake surrender more believable. Nobody said it was wrong. Nobody said it was dishonorable. Zekthor raised one of his 4 hands and spoke up. Is there no honor in human warfare? No rules? No rules. The classroom went quiet. Lieutenant Pierce looked at him with her forward-facing predator eyes. All humans had eyes like that, positioned to track prey. She said, Commander, honor is wonderful when both sides respect it. But in real war, the enemy will not care about honor. They will use every advantage to kill you. We teach our cadets to survive first and to win second. Honor comes third, if it comes at all. A student named George added, My grandfather always said that dead heroes are still dead. Better to be a living fighter who can win the next battle. The class agreed with nods and quiet words of approval. These young humans, barely trained, already understood that war was not about glory. It was about survival and victory at any cost. As the first day ended, Colonel Burton walked with Zekthor back to his guest quarters. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky orange and red. Burton asked, What do you think so far, Commander? Zekthor chose his words carefully. Your students are very focused on practical matters. They do not seem to value tradition as much as results. Burton laughed, a sound that made Zekthor nervous. That is because tradition does not win wars, Commander. Adaptation wins wars. Learning wins wars. We teach our cadets to think, not just to obey. That night, Zekthor lay in his bed, unable to sleep. He kept thinking about the classroom lessons, about young humans studying their ancestors' failures with cold calculation, about students learning to fight without honor when necessary, about a species that valued survival over tradition. The Vraxians had conquered 17 star systems. They were feared across the galaxy. But these humans had spent 10,000 years fighting each other on their death world. They had learned lessons in blood that other species never needed to learn. And now they were in space, offering friendship to the galaxy. Zekthor realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He had come here thinking humans were primitive newcomers who needed to learn from more advanced species. But after just one day, he was starting to understand the truth. Humans were not newcomers. They were survivors of a 10,000-year war against themselves. And they had won that war by learning to do whatever it took to survive. The question that kept Zekthor awake was simple and terrifying. If humans could be this dangerous to each other, what would they be like against an alien enemy? He would find out over the next 4 days, and each day would make him more afraid. The second day started before sunrise. Zekthor woke to the sound of cadets running past his window in the dark, their boots hitting the ground in rhythm. He looked at his clock and saw it was 5 in the morning. The temperature outside was below freezing, and light snow was falling. He dressed quickly and went to the training grounds where Colonel Burton had told him to meet Lieutenant Kyle Henderson. Henderson was a young human, probably in his early 30s, with short hair and a face that showed no emotion. He stood in front of 40 cadets who were dressed in thin clothing despite the cold. Zekthor wore his thermal suit, designed to keep him warm in any environment. The cadets wore only light jackets and pants. Some of them were shivering, but they stood at attention without complaining. Henderson looked at his watch and said, 20-mile run with full gear. You have 2.5 hours. Anyone slower than 3 hours runs it again. Move out. Zekthor checked his translator to make sure he heard correctly. 20 miles? That was over 30 kilometers. With Equipment? The Vraxian military did 10-kilometer runs with rest stops every 2 kilometers. This seemed impossible. Burton appeared next to Zekthor and said, "You can observe from the transport vehicle. It has heat and will follow the route." Zekthor climbed into the warm vehicle, grateful for the comfort. He watched through the window as the cadets started running. They moved fast, much faster than he expected. Surely they could not keep this pace for long, but they did keep the pace. Mile after mile, the cadets ran through snow and cold. Their breath came out in clouds, but their steps stayed steady. They ran up hills without slowing down. They ran through mud and ice without stopping. Around mile 12, Zekthor saw a young man named Danny stumble and fall. The cadet grabbed his ankle, and his face showed pain. Zekthor expected the group to stop and call for medical help. Instead, 2 other cadets, Eric and a female named Megan, simply picked up Danny's equipment and split it between themselves. Then they lifted Danny up, putting his arms over their shoulders, and kept running. They carried him the remaining 8 miles, while also carrying extra equipment. The entire group crossed the finish line together at 2 hours and 23 minutes. They were sweating despite the cold. Their faces were red, and their breathing was heavy. But they had finished. Henderson looked at them and said just one word: adequate. The cadets seemed to accept this as praise. They smiled at each other and helped Danny to the medical building. Zekthor asked Burton, "Why did they not stop for their injured friend?" Burton said, "Because in combat, the enemy will not stop. If one soldier falls, the others must adapt and continue the mission. We teach them that the team is more important than the individual." The afternoon session was worse, much worse. Zekthor followed the cadets to an indoor pool. The water was clear and deep. Henderson stood at the edge and explained the exercise. He called it drown-proofing. The cadets would have their hands tied behind their backs and their feet tied together. Then, they would be thrown into the deep end of the pool. They had to survive for 20 minutes without drowning. Zekthor felt sick. This was torture, not training. He started to protest, but Burton held up a hand and said, "Just watch." One by one, the cadets had their limbs bound and were pushed into the water. Zekthor watched in horror as they sank, then pushed off the bottom with their legs to reach the surface for air. They could not swim properly with their limbs tied. They could only jump off the bottom, grab a breath, and sink again. Some of them struggled badly. A small female cadet named Julie looked terrified. Her eyes were wide with panic each time she surfaced. But she did not quit. She kept jumping off the bottom, kept grabbing breaths, kept surviving. 20 minutes later, all the cadets were pulled out of the pool. They were exhausted and some of them were crying, but they had all survived. None of them had asked to quit. Zekthor turned to Burton and said, "This is cruel. Why do you do this to your young?" Burton's face remained calm as he said, "Because fear is a weapon, Commander. If our cadets cannot control their fear in a pool where safety is nearby, they will fail in combat, where death is real. We teach them to master their own biology." That evening, Zekthor watched more physical training. The cadets did something called obstacle courses. They climbed walls, crawled under barbed wire, swung across gaps on ropes, and carried heavy objects up steep hills. When a cadet named Peter failed to climb a wall on his first try, Henderson made the entire platoon do push-ups. Not just Peter. Everyone. Zekthor asked why. A cadet named Lisa, doing push-ups next to him, explained between breaths. "One person's failure is everyone's problem, sir. We succeed together, or we fail together. It makes us work harder to help each other." Zekthor had never seen this approach before. In Vraxian training, failure was individual. You were punished alone for your mistakes. But humans made failure collective, which meant everyone had a reason to help the weakest members improve. The day ended with hand-to-hand combat training. Zekthor expected to see formal martial arts, the kind of structured fighting that most military forces taught. Instead, he saw something that looked more like street fighting. The cadets learned to bite, to scratch, to gouge eyes, to strike groins, to use any method necessary to win. There were no rules about fair fighting. Henderson taught them that the goal was not to win with style, but simply to survive and disable the enemy by any means available. A cadet named Helen asked, "What if we are fighting someone much bigger and stronger?" Henderson smiled, the first smile Zekthor had seen from him. "Then you fight dirty. You use weapons, terrain, surprise, anything you can find. Remember, fair fights are for sports. Combat is about living while the other person dies." After training ended, Zekthor sat with some cadets in the dining hall. His body ached just from watching their exercises. He could not imagine actually doing them. A cadet named Victor sat down next to him with a tray of food. The young man had bruises on his face from combat training and a bandage on his hand. But he was smiling and joking with his friends. Zekthor asked him, "Does the training not bother you? The pain and suffering?" Victor thought about it while eating. Then he said, "Sure, it hurts, but pain is temporary. What we learn here might save our lives someday. I would rather suffer in training than die in real combat, because I was not prepared." Another cadet named Rachel added, "Besides, we all suffer together. That makes it easier. We push each other to keep going. Nobody wants to be the one who quits." Zekthor realized something important. Human training was not just about building strong bodies. It was about building strong minds. It was about teaching young humans that their bodies could do more than they thought possible. That pain was not a reason to stop. That fear could be controlled. The Vraxian military trained soldiers to be obedient and skilled, but the human military trained soldiers to be unstoppable. That night, Zekthor wrote in his personal log. He described what he had seen: the impossible runs, the controlled drowning, the collective punishment, the dirty fighting techniques. He ended his report with a sentence that surprised him as he wrote it. "Human soldiers are not trained to fight until they are tired. They are trained to fight until they are dead. And they are trained to accept this as normal." As he prepared for sleep, Zekthor heard boots running past his window again. He looked out and saw a small group of cadets doing extra training in the dark. They ran sprints up a steep hill, over and over, pushing themselves beyond what their instructors required. Nobody was forcing them. They chose to do this extra suffering. Zekthor closed the curtain and lay down, but sleep did not come easily. He kept thinking about the cadets in the pool, bound and helpless, fighting against their own panic. He thought about them carrying their injured friend for 8 miles without complaint. He thought about them doing push-ups together because one person failed. Humans did not just train individuals. They built teams that would never quit, never leave anyone behind, and never stop fighting. The Vraxian Empire had better technology. They had better weapons. But Zekthor was starting to fear that technology and weapons might not be enough against an enemy that simply refused to stop. The third day brought Zekthor to the Tactical Simulation Center. The building was large and filled with computers and display screens. Colonel Burton met him at the entrance, with a smile that made Zekthor nervous. Burton said, "Today, you will participate in a war game, Commander. You will command one side, and a team of our senior cadets will command the other. It should be educational, for everyone." Zekthor felt relieved. Finally, something where his experience and training would show human students the superior Vraxian military methods. He had 50 years of combat experience. These were just students. The scenario was explained by Major Chris Hamilton, who would observe and judge the exercise. Zekthor would command an invasion force trying to take a fortified position. He had 3 times as many troops as the defenders, air superiority, and better technology. The defenders were dug in with limited supplies and no way to get reinforcements. By every logical measure, Zekthor should win easily. This would be a good way to show humans how real military professionals fought. The human team was led by a cadet named Jack. He was a quiet young man, average height, with dark hair and intense eyes. With him were three other cadets. Kate was tall and seemed to be their defensive specialist. Greg was stocky and handled artillery. Laura was small but confident and worked on intelligence and communications. The simulation began. Zekthor deployed his forces using a standard pincer movement, a tactic that had won the Vraxians countless victories across the galaxy. His troops would attack from two sides while air support hit the humans from above. The enemy would be crushed between three forces. The humans fortified their position and waited. Zekthor pressed forward, expecting them to either surrender or try a desperate breakout that he could easily stop. Instead, something happened that Zekthor had never seen in 50 years of military service. Kate's defensive force, about half of the human troops, suddenly broadcast a surrender signal. They lowered their weapons and stopped shooting. Following standard Vraxian protocol, Zekthor moved forces forward to accept the surrender and take prisoners. The moment his troops came close, the surrendering humans picked up their weapons and opened fire at point-blank range. At the same instant, Greg's artillery, which Zekthor thought he had destroyed earlier, unleashed a massive barrage on his command center. Zekthor stared at the screens in shock. His command center was gone. His forward troops were being slaughtered. The surrender had been a lie, a trap. He turned to Hamilton and said, "That is cheating. False surrender is against all rules of war." Hamilton looked at him calmly and replied, "It is against your rules, Commander. But Jack's team is outnumbered 3-1. They cannot win by following your rules. So they make their own rules. In real war, the enemy will not fight fair. We do not train our people to fight fair. We train them to win." The simulation continued. Zekthor regrouped his forces, angry now and determined to crush these dishonest humans. But everything he did seemed to fall apart. Laura's intelligence team somehow got access to Vraxian military codes. She used them to broadcast false orders on his communication channels. His own units started shooting at each other, thinking they were following real commands. By the time Zekthor realized what was happening and changed all the codes, he had lost another 15% of his forces. Jack conducted what seemed like a retreat, pulling his forces back. Zekthor pursued, thinking he had them trapped. But the retreat was not a panic. It was controlled. The humans withdrew slowly, setting traps as they went. Every mile, Zekthor advanced cost him more troops. Every building his forces entered exploded. Every road they used was mined. When Zekthor finally cornered the remaining human forces in a large building, he had them trapped with no escape. He prepared for a final assault that would end the simulation. Greg had rigged the entire building with explosives. The building detonated, destroying the remaining human forces, but also taking out 70% of Zekthor's attacking troops. The simulation ended with Zekthor technically winning because he held the territory. The screens went dark. Zekthor sat in silence, staring at the casualty numbers. Jack and his team came over for the debrief. The young cadet looked at Zekthor and said, "In a real war, Commander, you would not have won. Your government would have pulled you back after 30% losses. Your people would demand to know why so many died for one position. But we would keep fighting. That is the difference between us," Kate added. "We made you pay for every meter of ground. Even when we lost, we made sure you lost more. That is what we call asymmetric warfare. We cannot match you in strength, so we match you in will." Hamilton asked Zekthor what he learned. The Vraxian commander thought carefully before answering. He said, "I learned that human soldiers do not follow the rules I know. They adapt to every situation. They use tactics that my people would consider dishonorable." Jack nodded and said, "Exactly. We learned a long time ago that honor does not stop bullets. Honor does not win wars. The only thing that matters is survival and victory. Everything else is just pride." Zekthor asked, But what about treaties? What about the rules of war that all civilized species follow? Laura spoke up. We will follow rules when our enemy follows rules. But the moment they break the rules, we break them harder. We will not die because we were too honorable to do what needed to be done. The afternoon brought more tactical exercises. Zekthor watched as cadets practiced different scenarios. In one exercise, they were surrounded by superior forces. Their solution was to fake a retreat in one direction, then attack in the opposite direction while the enemy was out of position. In another exercise, they were defending a city. Instead of holding positions and fighting, they evacuated civilians and burned the city themselves, denying the enemy any resources while retreating to better defensive positions. A cadet named Frank explained the thinking. A city is just buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt. But if we lose our troops trying to hold buildings, we cannot get those troops back. We trade space for time, and we trade things for lives. Zekthor realized these humans thought about war differently than any species he had encountered. The Vraxians fought for honor and territory. Most species in the galaxy fought until one side could no longer afford the cost. But humans fought with cold calculation, caring nothing for honor or glory, focused only on the goal of survival and victory. Another simulation put Zekthor against a different team. This time he knew to expect tricks and deception. But knowing they would cheat did not help him stop them. The human team used new tactics he had not seen before. They pretended to be weaker than they were, baiting him into overextending. They used civilians as cover, making Zekthor choose between killing innocents or letting enemies escape. They hacked his drones and turned them against his own forces. They poisoned water supplies that his troops needed. Every rule of civilized warfare that Zekthor knew, the humans broke without hesitation. When this simulation ended, with another costly victory for Zekthor, he asked Hamilton a question that had been bothering him all day. Do your people feel no shame about these tactics? No guilt about breaking every rule? Hamilton thought about it, then said, Commander, let me tell you about human history. We spent 10,000 years fighting each other. We developed rules for war, yes, honor codes, treaties. But we also learned that when survival is at stake, rules become suggestions. The species that followed rules died. The species that adapted survived. And here we are, he continued. We do feel guilt. We do understand honor. But we also understand that dead soldiers cannot feel guilty, and defeated nations cannot be honorable. So we teach our cadets to win first, and to deal with guilt later, if they survive. That evening, Zekthor sat alone in the observation room, watching cadets practice more tactical scenarios. A group of 5 humans was fighting a simulated force of 20 enemies. They should have been destroyed quickly. Instead, they split up, used the terrain, set ambushes, retreated when needed, and slowly reduced the enemy numbers. When the simulation ended, all 5 humans had survived, and the enemy force was eliminated. The cadets reviewed their performance, pointing out mistakes they made and discussing how to improve. They were not celebrating their victory. They were learning from it. Zekthor understood something important in that moment. Human military training was not about teaching students to fight. It was about teaching them to think. Every exercise was a puzzle. Every defeat was a lesson. Every rule was optional if breaking it led to survival. The Vraxian military had thousands of years of tradition. They had standard tactics that worked across different planets and enemies. But those tactics assumed the enemy would fight a certain way, would follow certain rules. Humans had no such assumptions. They assumed the enemy would do anything to win, so they prepared to do anything to survive. Later, Jack found Zekthor in the dining hall and sat down across from him. The young cadet asked, "Are you angry about the fake surrender?" Zekthor considered the question. Finally, he said, "Yes, but I am also frightened. Your people have turned war into a science with no rules." Jack nodded slowly. That is because we learned through blood and death. Every trick we use today, some human in history used it first in a real war. Every dirty tactic, every deception, every violation of honor, our ancestors did it to each other. We wrote the book on how to fight without rules because we had to learn how to survive against enemies who showed no mercy. He paused, then added, "We offer the galaxy our friendship. We want peace. But if someone starts a war with us, they need to understand what they are facing. They are not facing an army that follows rules. They are facing a species that has spent 10,000 years learning how to kill." Zekthor left the dining hall with Jack's words echoing in his mind. He had 2 more days at this academy. Part of him wanted to leave now, to go back to his ship and his own people. But he needed to see more. He needed to understand fully what humanity was capable of, because the Vraxian High Command needed to know the truth. They needed to know that these small, fragile-looking humans were the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever seen. The 4th day was supposed to be easier. Colonel Burton had scheduled a history lecture, a cultural exchange where Zekthor could learn about human warfare through time. After 3 days of physical exhaustion and tactical nightmares, sitting in a classroom seemed like a relief. Zekthor was completely wrong about that. The lecture hall was large, with seats arranged in rising rows. About 200 cadets filled the room, along with Zekthor and several other military observers. The teacher was Professor Stephen Carter, a civilian with gray hair and several academic degrees in military history. Carter began his lecture with a simple statement that made Zekthor's blood run cold. Today we will discuss total war. This is a concept that most galactic civilizations have never experienced. But for humans, total war has been normal for most of our history. He brought up images on the large screen behind him. Cities in ruins, bodies stacked in massive piles, entire landscapes burned and destroyed. Carter continued. Total war means that everything becomes a target. Not just armies, but cities, farms, factories, civilians. The goal is not to defeat the enemy's military. The goal is to destroy the enemy's ability and will to fight by any means necessary. Zekthor had studied many wars across the galaxy. Most civilizations fought over territory or resources. When one side lost too many soldiers or spent too much money, they surrendered or negotiated peace. Wars ended when they became too expensive to continue. But Carter explained that human wars often ended only when one side was completely destroyed or so broken they could never fight again. The first example was something called World War II. Carter showed numbers on the screen that Zekthor had to check 3 times because they seemed impossible. Over 60 million humans died in just 6 years. 60 million. That was more than the total population of 3 Vraxian colony worlds. And humans had done this to each other over political and philosophical differences. Carter showed images of cities destroyed by bombing. He explained how both sides deliberately targeted civilian populations, trying to break enemy morale by killing families and burning homes. The bombing of Hamburg created a firestorm, Carter said, showing images of a city burning. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees. 40,000 civilians died in a single night. Both sides bombed each other's cities like this for years. A cadet named Brandon raised his hand and asked, "Why did nobody surrender?" The casualties were huge. Carter nodded as if expecting the question. Because both sides believed they were fighting for survival. And when a human believes their survival is threatened, they will burn the world down rather than give up. We are persistence predators, Brandon. Giving up is not in our nature. The lecture continued with more examples. Carter described the Eastern Front, where humans fought in winter temperatures that would kill most species within hours. Battles claimed millions of lives for cities that changed hands multiple times. Soldiers fought in frozen mud, eating rats to survive, dying by the thousands every day. He showed images of the Pacific Campaign, where humans fought on jungle islands for years. The defending soldiers often chose to kill themselves rather than surrender. They believed surrender was the ultimate shame. So they charged machine guns with swords, knowing they would die. Zekthor interrupted. But this is insane. Why not just surrender and live? The room went quiet. Several cadets turned to look at him. Carter's expression remained neutral as he answered. Because, Commander, humans would rather die free than live as slaves. This is hard for most species to understand. For us, there are things worse than death, and we will fight until death to avoid those things. The lecture moved to more recent history, but the violence did not decrease. Carter showed a conflict called Vietnam, where a smaller, less advanced nation defeated a technological superpower through sheer determination. He showed conflicts in the Middle East that lasted decades. He showed civil wars where families killed each other over beliefs. But it was the final part of the lecture that truly broke Zekthor's understanding of this species. Carter's voice became quieter as he said, and then humanity developed nuclear weapons. We are the only species in the Galactic Council who has actually used nuclear weapons in war. Not just built them, used them. The screen showed 2 cities before and after. The after images showed nothing but flat, burned ground where cities had stood. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Carter said. 200,000 people died, most of them civilians. These weapons ended the war. But we did not stop there. We made them bigger, much bigger. He showed images of massive explosions that could destroy entire regions. At the height of what we called the Cold War, humanity possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on Earth 50 times over, and we aimed them at ourselves for 45 years. A female cadet named Nicole asked, "Why did we not destroy ourselves?" Carter's answer was simple and terrifying. Mutually assured destruction. We knew that if one side launched their weapons, the other side would launch theirs, and everyone would die. So we did not attack because we knew we would also be destroyed. That is what stopped us. Not morality, not honor, not diplomacy, just the practical certainty that we would die too. He let that sink in, then continued. We spent 45 years with our finger on the button that would end all human life. We almost pressed it several times, but we did not. We stared at the end of our world and chose to step back. Zekthor tried to process this information. The Vraxians had nuclear weapons but had never used them. Most species developed them and immediately agreed to never use them. It was considered insane to actually deploy such weapons, but humans had used them in war, had made thousands of them, had prepared to end their own species, and somehow they had survived that insanity and moved forward. Carter showed more examples of human conflict. He showed economic wars, where nations destroyed each other's trade. He showed cyber warfare, where humans attacked each other's computer systems. He showed biological research into weapons that could kill millions. The point of this lecture, Carter said as he neared the end, is to understand that humanity has been at war with itself for 10,000 years. We have tried every possible way to kill each other. We have refined murder into an art form. We have studied death the way other species study mathematics. He paused and looked around the room. And now we are in space. Now we are part of the galactic community. We offer friendship and alliance to all species. But you need to understand what we are offering. You are not allying with peaceful philosophers. You are allying with survivors of the longest, bloodiest war in known history. A war we fought against ourselves. After the lecture, cadets left the room quietly. The usual chatter and jokes were absent. Even young humans seemed affected by their own history. Zekthor approached Carter as he gathered his materials. The professor looked at him and waited. Zekthor said, "Your people are insane. This is not an insult. It is an observation, based on evidence." Carter smiled, but it was a sad smile. "No, Commander, we are not insane. We are human. There is a difference. Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. We learned from every war, we adapted, we survived. That is not insanity. That is evolution through fire. He gathered his papers and added, every tactic we showed you this week, every trick, every dirty method of fighting, we learned it by using it on each other first. We know how to fight without rules because we wrote the book on breaking rules. And now that we have faster than light travel, we are everyone's problem. Carter left the lecture hall, leaving Zekthor alone with his thoughts. That evening, Zekthor did not eat dinner with the cadets. He went to his quarters and began writing a detailed report to the Vraxian High Command. He described everything he had seen and learned. He wrote about the physical training that pushed humans beyond what should be possible. He wrote about the tactical exercises that taught students to ignore every rule of civilized warfare. And he wrote about today's history lecture, about a species that had spent 10,000 years fighting itself and somehow survived. His conclusion was simple and urgent. Recommend immediate alliance with humanity. Recommend we strengthen this alliance with every resource available. And most importantly, recommend that we never, under any circumstances, give humanity a reason to consider us an enemy. He sat back and read his words. A week ago, he had come to Earth expecting to meet primitive newcomers who needed guidance from advanced species like the Vraxians. Now he understood the truth. Humanity was not primitive. They were survivors of a crucible that no other species had endured. They had turned their own planet into a training ground for warfare. They had spent millennia fighting each other with every weapon imaginable, including weapons that could end all life. And they had survived it all. The question that haunted Zekthor as he prepared for his final day was simple. If humans could be this dangerous to each other, if they could bring themselves to the edge of extinction and step back, what would they be like against an alien enemy that they did not have to feel guilty about killing? He did not want to find out. He hoped the galaxy would never find out. But he feared that someday, someone would make the mistake of threatening humanity, and then the galaxy would learn what 10,000 years of warfare had created. Tomorrow was his last day at the academy. He had one more exercise to observe. Part of him dreaded it. But he needed to see it through. He needed to complete his report so that the Vraxian High Command would understand the truth. Humanity was not just another species joining the galactic community. They were the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered. And they were offering friendship. The wise choice was to accept that friendship and never, ever break it. The fifth and final day began with Colonel Burton arriving at Zekthor's quarters before sunrise. The human officer looked energized, almost excited. Today you will not just observe, Commander, Burton said. You will participate. We have a live fire exercise in the mountains. You will join one of our cadet teams. Nothing too dangerous. Just a standard field training operation. Zekthor felt nervous. The past 4 days had shown him that nothing humans did was standard. But he agreed. He was a soldier. After all, he could handle field exercises. He was assigned to a team of 6 cadets. Kevin was the team leader, a tall young man with a calm demeanor. Ashley was their medic, small but confident. Lisa handled communications. Chris was their heavy weapons specialist. Emma was their scout. And Stephen, the youngest, seemed to handle everything else. Burton explained the exercise as they prepared their equipment. Simple mission. Your team and 5 other teams will move through a 10-mile course in the mountains. You will overcome obstacles and engage simulated enemies. First team to complete the course and capture the final objective wins. Zekthor noticed the cadets were carrying heavy packs, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, communications gear, and various other equipment. Each pack probably weighed 40 or 50 pounds. The terrain was steep and rocky. This would not be easy, but Zekthor had trained on difficult worlds before. He could manage 10 miles. The exercise started badly. Within the first mile, Ashley stepped wrong on a loose rock and fell. Zekthor heard the crack of bone breaking. Ashley's ankle was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made Zekthor wince. "We need to call for medical evacuation," Zekthor said. The cadets looked at him strangely. Chris pulled out a medical kit, and Ashley, her face pale with pain, took out an injection. She stabbed the needle into her leg without hesitation. Within seconds, her eyes became more focused despite the pain. Chris wrapped her ankle with a splint made from branches and tape. Ashley stood up, testing the makeshift support. She limped, but she could move. "I can still shoot," Ashley said. "I am staying with the team." Kevin nodded, and they continued. Zekthor was stunned. A broken ankle should end someone's participation in any exercise. But Ashley just kept moving, limping, but keeping pace with the group. At mile 3, they reached a ravine. A rope bridge had once crossed it, but the bridge was now destroyed, hanging in pieces. The gap was 30 feet across. The bottom of the ravine was 100 feet down with sharp rocks. Stephen, without discussing it with anyone, simply took a running start and jumped. He caught one of the hanging ropes, swung across, and landed on the other side. Then he used climbing equipment to rig a new crossing. "Humans evolved as climbers and throwers," Lisa explained when she saw Zekthor's expression. "We are really good at both. It is one of our survival advantages." 2. The team crossed the new rope bridge one by one. Even Ashley made it across, despite her broken ankle. On the other side, they reorganized and continued. The mountains were steep, the trail was rough. Zekthor, even with his 2 hearts and superior Vraxian physiology, was struggling. His breathing was heavy. His muscles ached, but the humans kept moving at a steady pace, and he refused to be the one who slowed them down. At mile 5, they encountered their first simulated enemy position. 3 defenders were dug in behind rocks with clear fields of fire. A frontal assault would be suicide. Kevin gathered the team and quickly outlined a plan. "Emma and Lisa, you make noise and draw their attention. Kevin and Chris, flank right. Ashley and Stephen, flank left. Commander, you are our reserve. When I whistle, you charge straight up the middle." Zekthor started to protest. This was the same kind of reckless plan he had seen in the simulations. But before he could speak, the cadets were already moving. Emma and Lisa opened fire, immediately drawing return fire from the defenders, but they stayed in cover, popping up to shoot and then ducking down. They were not trying to win, just to survive and distract. Kevin and Chris moved through the rocks with incredible speed and silence. Despite carrying heavy equipment, they covered the rough terrain in less than 2 minutes. Stephen and Ashley, even with her broken ankle, flanked from the other side just as quickly. When both flanking teams were in position, Stephen whistled. Zekthor, following orders despite every instinct screaming at him to stay in cover, charged up the middle. The defenders were already being shot at from both sides. They were confused, trying to cover 3 directions at once. When Zekthor appeared from the front, they broke and retreated. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute. No casualties on Zekthor's team. The enemy position was taken. "Textbook flanking maneuver," Kevin said calmly, as if they had just completed a simple classroom exercise instead of a dangerous assault. The exercise continued. At mile 7, they had to cross a fast-moving stream that was waist-deep and very cold. At mile 8, they had to climb a steep cliff using ropes. At mile 9, another enemy position that they defeated using similar tactics. Zekthor was exhausted. His body ached. His breathing was labored. But the humans kept moving. Ashley was still limping on her broken ankle. Emma had twisted her wrist on the cliff climb. Chris had a deep cut on his arm from catching himself during a fall. But none of them complained or asked to stop. The final objective was a fortified position at the top of a hill. Intelligence suggested 5 defenders with heavy weapons and elevated positions. A frontal assault would be impossible. The team gathered behind cover to plan their approach. Kevin looked at each member, assessing their condition. Then, he outlined his plan. "We do not have the strength for a prolonged fight. We hit them fast and hard. Lisa and Emma, You are the distraction again. Make a lot of noise. Make them think you are the main attack. Kevin and Chris, flank right side. Ashley and Stephen, flank left. Commander, you wait for my signal. Then straight up the middle just like before. Zekthor said. Lisa and Emma will be killed. They are drawing all the fire. Stephen replied. They will be in good cover. They just need to survive 30 seconds. We can do anything for 30 seconds. The plan began. Lisa and Emma started shooting, and the defenders immediately returned fire with everything they had. The noise was tremendous. Simulated bullets hit the rocks around Lisa and Emma, sending up sparks and dust. But the two women held their position. They did not run. They did not panic. They just kept shooting and ducking, drawing attention away from the flanking teams. Kevin and Chris moved like ghosts through the terrain. Ashley, despite her broken ankle, kept pace with Stephen on the left flank. They reached their positions in exactly 30 seconds. Stephen's whistle cut through the noise. Zekthor charged up the middle. The defenders were already being hit from both sides. They tried to adjust their fire, but it was too late. 3 directions of attack overwhelmed them. The position fell in 43 seconds. The cadets had won. As they celebrated their victory, Zekthor stood apart, trying to process what he had just experienced. These were students, not fully trained soldiers, yet they had just completed a 10-mile course through mountains, overcome multiple obstacles, defeated multiple enemy positions, and captured a fortified objective. And they had done it with a broken ankle, twisted wrist, cut arm, and other minor injuries that should have ended their participation. They had done it while carrying heavy equipment. They had done it faster than Zekthor thought possible. Colonel Burton appeared, having observed from a command vehicle. He approached Zekthor as the cadets gathered their equipment. "What do you think of our training, Commander?" Burton asked. Zekthor took a long moment before answering. He chose his words carefully, knowing this report would go to the highest levels of Vraxian command. "I think that the Vraxian Empire will recommend immediate and permanent alliance with humanity. And I think we will do everything possible to ensure this alliance never breaks. Because, Colonel, if there is one thing I have learned this week, it is that humanity must never be our enemy." Burton smiled. It was not a cruel smile or a mocking smile. It was the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully made their point. "We are glad to hear that, Commander. We are looking forward to being friends with the Vraxian Empire and all members of the Galactic Council." That evening, as Zekthor's shuttle prepared for departure, he stood on the landing pad and looked back at the academy. Young humans were still training in the fading light, running, climbing, shooting, preparing for wars they hoped would never come. But if those wars did come, Zekthor now understood what the galaxy would face. Not just soldiers, not just warriors, but a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of survival through violence. A species that did not know how to quit. A species that would rather die than surrender. The Vraxians had conquered 17 star systems. They were feared across the galaxy. But they had never faced an enemy like humanity. An enemy that fought without honor when necessary. An enemy that adapted to every situation. An enemy that simply refused to accept defeat. Zekthor boarded his shuttle and immediately began his final report to the High Command. He described every detail of his 5 days at the Human Military Academy. The impossible physical training. The tactical exercises that ignored every rule of civilized warfare. The history of total war. The live exercise where injured cadets refused to quit. His final recommendation was clear and urgent. Establish permanent military alliance with humanity. Share technology and resources. Integrate human tactical doctrine into our own training. And most importantly, never give humanity a reason to consider us a threat. He added one final note, a quote from a cadet named Emma that he felt summarized everything about human military philosophy. When asked what she would do if faced with an unbeatable enemy, She had smiled and said, "Change the definition of unbeatable." As the shuttle left Earth's atmosphere, Zekthor looked down at the blue and green planet. It looked peaceful from space, beautiful even. But he now knew the truth. That peaceful-looking planet had forged a species through 10,000 years of warfare. They had fought each other with every weapon imaginable. They had brought themselves to the edge of extinction with nuclear weapons. They had survived ice ages, plagues, famines, and countless wars. And they had emerged from all of that stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than any species in the galaxy. Now they were in space. Now they had faster-than-light travel. Now they were offering friendship to the civilized species of the Galactic Council. The wise choice, the only sane choice, was to accept that friendship with both hands and hold on to it forever, because the alternative, making an enemy of humanity, was too terrible to imagine. Zekthor completed his report and sent it to Vraxian High Command with the highest priority flag. Then he sat back and tried to process everything he had learned. He had come to Earth 5 days ago thinking humans were primitive newcomers who needed guidance. He was leaving with the certain knowledge that humanity was the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered, and they were on his side. That thought, more than anything else, allowed Zekthor to finally relax. As the shuttle jumped to faster-than-light speed, heading back to Vraxian space, he allowed himself to feel relief. The humans were allies. They would fight alongside the Vraxian Empire, not against it. Their terrifying determination, their refusal to quit, their 10,000 years of combat experience. All of that would be on his side in any future conflict. The galaxy had changed. A new player had entered the game, and Zekthor had been fortunate enough to see them up close before anyone else. He would make sure the Vraxian Empire understood what he had learned. That humans were not just another species to be managed or guided. They were equals, at minimum, and possibly superiors in the art of warfare. But most importantly, they were friends. And Zekthor would do everything in his power to keep them as friends, because he never wanted to see what humans were like as enemies.